right, everyone, it's 2 p.m. on the dot, so we're going to get started. Again, my name is Ariel Leggett. I'm one of the Retail Solutions Advisors here at Retail Control Systems. And Alex Koppel, he's our Manager of Strategic Initiatives. He'll be presenting on the API, the Counterpoint API today. Welcome to our webinar. If you have questions, please submit them in the questions box. If they're relevant to what Alex is talking about, I will do my best to interrupt him and get those questions answered. Otherwise, we'll answer all of the questions at the end of the webinar. So Alex, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Ariel. Thanks for the intro, and welcome everybody to the webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the NCR Counterpoint API. And I just kind of wanted to start off and say, I've done this presentation a couple of times to a couple different audiences, and I think that one of the biggest takeaways that I have for it is the interesting thing with the API is it's a mix of what is possible with the API and inside of Counterpoint, and then also obviously the development side of it of how do you submit API calls and whatnot. So full disclosure, I'm not a developer. I know what's possible with the API, and I can speak with a certain amount of expertise as far as what people are doing, how the API works, and what its features and functions are. But certainly if you are a developer and want to get more information specific to making API requests and stuff like that, I will give you all the resources as part of this webinar to do that. And we certainly have in-house development resources that can additionally assist in making those calls when you get to that point. So I'm going to start off at a pretty basic level. Switch over here. First slide here is, what is an API? So API stands for Application Program Interface, which is basically a fancy way of saying that there's a standardized way to push and pull data to and from a program, in this case, NCR Counterpoint. So prior to having the API, which was released almost a year ago at this point, prior to having the API, the best way to get data into and out of Counterpoint was actually copying databases. So we would copy databases, store them somewhere, and then query against that database. And the problem with that was it's not real time. Your data is sitting in a location that's not your Counterpoint database, whether that be a separate server or something like that. And it required a lot of know-how. You had to know all the different Counterpoint tables, and you had to know how they all function together. And the best way I can just explain it is it's kind of a brute force attack if you're trying to add data back into Counterpoint. So if the data is not valid, or for whatever reason it doesn't mesh with what Counterpoint thinks should be there, you're going to get Counterpoint errors and problems inside of the system because you're just pushing the data into the back end to be read by Counterpoint, but the program has no way of knowing, is this valid data or is it not valid data? So those were some issues with the way that we used to do integrations into Counterpoint. We still do that for some applications, but really moving forward, the API allows you to do these functions inside of Counterpoint natively. And even cooler, it allows you to do it in a way that's not going to be as affected by future upgrades and changes to the system, because the API is going to change right along with the platform. So once you make something, it's going to be stable for longer with less oversight. The other cool thing which may affect some people here is that when you do an API call, it's the identical call regardless of system. So if you make a call to system A, database A, you don't have to rewrite the entire script to do it for a different database. You can use the exact same script and just change a couple of things to make it work across both platforms. So it's a way to standardize those calls across the Counterpoint ecosystem. One of the first things I want to show everybody here is actually an example of what we here at Retail Control Systems have done with this API already, just as an example to customers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close out of my presentation here real quick, and I'm going to bring up this Counterpoint API portal. So what we've done here is,
Alex, sorry to interrupt. It's Ariel. I just have one attendee saying that they're only seeing a black screen. Is anyone else only seeing a black screen, or is everyone able to see what Alex is presenting? Okay, it looks like others are able to see. Okay, so please proceed. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not a problem. Glad we can, hopefully we can get that resolved. You can try logging out and logging back in if that's helpful to you, so you can try and see that screen. There'll also be a recording of this webinar sent out to everybody. So if you miss something, you'll be able to go in and see the recording at that point. So right on this main screen here, what we've done is we've made this portal. Now this is a website, and what we've done is basically allowed you to, if we turn this on for you, you can come in here and put in where your server is located and your API key and login and password. And once you input all that information, we've opened up a couple of apps. So I'm going to start with this application that we developed to allow customers to check a gift card balance. So this is a really simple script. And what this does is, you can see here, it just gives me a couple fields. And if I go ahead and type in a gift card number, I can hit check balance. It will query Counterpoint in real time, and it'll give me back my current balance, which is $50. Now this is cool, but obviously you're not going to send your customers to api.retailcontrolsystems.com. So we've actually taken this a step further, and what we've done is we've allowed you to generate a script. And what you can do is you can copy this iframe right here and drop it into a website or a mobile phone application, a blank website with no buttons that you could use as a kiosk in your location, something like that. And all you do is copy paste this into your website. You can change the size, change anything else that you want to do about it, and it will just show you this box here to your customers, and they can use it from any web capable device. So this is a simple example of an application that we quickly were able to build. And the cool thing is because we're using the API, we can actually send that out to multiple people. We don't have to redevelop it for every new customer. Everybody that uses Counterpoint that has the API can actually use a program like this. So you're going to see both RCS and other third parties really start developing with this API and make it very easy for you to add on to your Counterpoint system. Some of the other examples here that we've worked on are loyalty points application. So this one's a little bit more complicated than just a gift card. Basically what this allows you to do is I can choose which fields from my customer record to display. I can show which ones are required. I can change the label of any of the fields just for a public facing type thing. And I can have default fields. So in this example, I've got my default field set up. I can set up what's required, what isn't required. And if I go ahead and view this demo, I can look up my profile. So in this case, I'm doing it based off of loyalty number. I believe I have a loyalty number in here. I don't have one in here, but basically you can look it up and it will come back with how many loyalty points you have. And you can say, okay, my loyalty number is my searchable field. So this is a way that you don't have customer information out in the internet. And same as the gift card one, this just gives you an iframe application to put on your website. So again, right from here, you could have a way for customers to check their loyalty balances in real time. And the last one, which is the most complicated or most complex one, is a sign up for a loyalty program. Now, this is something that's been a big request over the years for us, and it's always been a challenge because every customer needs custom development work to make it happen. So what we did is we decided to do it all up front and say, hey, you don't need custom work to make this work for you on your website or on a kiosk or iPad or something at your location. Same thing, you can we've taken all the various fields in the Counterpoint customer record, including profile codes. You can activate whether they display to the customer, whether they're required or not, and what the default is. A good example of these defaults is I can require what loyalty program they're going to go into. And in this case, my loyalty program is called Loyalty. So the customer never sees this, but on the back end, it's adding this into their Counterpoint record. So I can automatically add in their loyalty program. So I can select what fields I want, what's required, what isn't. I can view a demo of what it's going to look like. So in this case, it's going to ask for all my information. Once I put all that in, I can add a customer, and it's going to add that customer to Counterpoint. And same as the other ones, I can just generate a script and copy paste that onto a website. So just a brief example of what's possible with the API. We have a number of e-commerce platforms using this integration, the API, to build out their e-commerce integrations. And that's really the biggest thing that this API was built for at this point anyway, is it was built to do e-commerce integrations. So you can, when you start to think through that, you can say, okay, what's possible in the API? And really, it's anything that an e-commerce integration would use. So customer, item and inventory information, product availability, payments, credit card payments, that sort of thing. And we'll go through some of these endpoints here so we can get a better understanding of what's available. So why would you pick an API? Why would you use the Counterpoint API instead of the old way of development? Number one is you're going to limit the duplication of data. Your data is still going to just live in one location, which is going to be the Counterpoint SQL tables. The API is just querying those tables. So it's not copying the data, nothing's going anywhere. And because of that, that helps keep your data secure. So that data is going to stay in its secure environment. It's not going to be copied anywhere and live in a third party's environment or anything like that. The other big benefit is real-time data. So the Counterpoint API is querying in real time. That means that for those of you that are used to developing with copying databases, there's no, hey, we're copying this database every 5 minutes or 10 minutes or once a day. This is all real-time information. So as soon as it happens in Counterpoint, it happens in the API. Limits the development time. You can go out and find a developer, show them all the documentation on the API, which I'll show you in a minute. And really they can pretty quickly and easily get the hang of it and develop for Counterpoint. They don't have to be a Counterpoint expert to figure out what's going on with the API. And the last benefit is the API is completely free. So while there may be some setup cost if you need RCS to help you set up and configure the API, the actual licensing for it and any of the actual pieces needed to operate the API are completely free. There's no cost from NCR to use this product. So I encourage you all to go get set up after this and make sure that you can start playing around in your test environments and getting a feel for it and see what's possible. So the next question, inevitably after the free, after it comes out that it's free, is everybody wants to know, well, how do I go about getting the API? So essentially, all you need to do is have a relatively recent version of Counterpoint. Anybody that's, I'll have to look at the documentation, but I believe it's anybody that's on 8.4.6.15 or newer is going to be all set with the API. So anybody on a relatively recent version of Counterpoint, all you need to do is get your API registration key. So there is a new registration key that you'll need. And again, that's free. So you can just reach out to your RCS account rep and say, I want the API, and we'll get it ordered for you and get it installed on your system. That just opens up being able to access the API on your system. Step 2 is going to be install the API server. So typically this is installed wherever your Counterpoint is, whether that, if you have an application server, it'll be installed on that, or another computer that has access to the Counterpoint databases. The API server is a very lightweight service, very similar to like your CP services or something like that, that just runs on the server. And what it does is it allows you to configure all of your endpoints and permissions. And it also listens, it's the program that's listening for those web calls to come in, so that you can, when a web call is made, it queries the Counterpoint data and sends out the answer. After the API server is installed and configured, which we'll go into a little bit more in a second here, you do need to open the ports that the API server uses. The default port is 52,000, but you can configure that when you install the API. It asks you what port you want to use. So you can configure it to the best practices of your company, and make sure that your firewall ports are open to allow incoming and outgoing traffic to that API server. There's some configuration of the API server, which we'll get into. And then lastly, if you're doing any advanced development work, you do need an API key. Now, you do get this from NCR. It's free. But what NCR is requesting is that you do this key application process, which I'll show you in a minute, for each program that you deploy. And the reason they want to do this, one, is some additional security for you and for them. But two, what they're doing is they're actually building a kind of list of what customers are using the API for what. And the reason they're doing that is a couple things. One, they're curious and they want to know who's doing what and what it's being used for. Two, it's going to help drive the development of the product. We're already on version 2 of the API, and they're going to continue to develop this product. So if a lot of customers are using it for certain things and not other things, that's what's going to drive that development. And lastly, we've actually run into this a couple times where customers have called us and said, we want to do an integration or we want to use the API for this. And NCR comes back and says, hey, we've got another customer working on that very same integration. Why don't you guys collaborate on it and work together? So it allows them to basically make sure that there's as little duplication of work as possible across the NCR Counterpoint channel. And that's, of course, at the discretion of the company. They're not going to hand out your contact information to somebody, but they will maybe ask you, hey, is it all right if we share your information with this other customer? So that's basically the steps to the deployment of the API. So nice and easy and straightforward. Next thing I want to show you, it's kind of interesting because because the API is a fully free product. It's public source, open source rather. There's actually, I don't know if everybody's familiar with the site GitHub, but it's a public repository for developers. And actually, if you go on GitHub, it's just GitHub, GITHUB.com, and then search NCR Counterpoint. You're going to find the API guide. And the cool thing about this API guide is this has all of the documentation on NCR Counterpoint. I know that this might be small on people's screens, so don't worry about reading this at this point. You can go look at all this documentation at your leisure. But basically what this does is it walks you through a step-by-step installation, configuring, everything you need to know about the API and what it is, what it can do, is all available for free to everybody, not just Counterpoint users. Now, this has a ton of information in it, so take your time, read through everything. It's got all the minimum requirements. The other thing that it has that I think a lot of people miss are these API tests. So we've got the API guide and then API tests. And the cool thing that this actually allows you to do is to come in here, and it actually has all of the code using a program called Postman, which is a really easy to use development tool that our in-house developers love. So using Postman, this allows you to actually download these test files that have all of the calls pre-built to a certain extent, obviously based on your environment. And this will actually allow you to run tests, and you can just take that code and configure it to your use. So I've found a lot of people have said, hey, can we do this or do that? And a lot of times the answer is, yeah, absolutely. And not just that, but most of the code is already written for you. So really, this website is the core of the API. And this is one of the reasons why I don't want to get too deep into the coding side of it, because there's all of the information available for you right on the site in an easy to read format. But there is a lot of information, so make sure you go through it and read it very carefully as you go through. In my experience, about 9 out of 10 questions that get asked to me about the API, I typically will go right to this documentation, pull up the answer, and send it off to the customer. So a lot of times the information's in here, just have to dig around and find it. As far as endpoints, an endpoint is, okay, what can we do? What can we get information into and out of Counterpoint? It's considered an endpoint. And basically, if you go into API guides/endpoints, this is a list of all the different endpoints that you have accessible to you. And this is code language. So we've got delete, get. Delete is pretty self-explanatory. Get is you're getting the information out of Counterpoint. Patch means you're updating information. So you're not creating a new record, you're just updating existing information. Post is creating a new record in Counterpoint. And then put is going to be more of your, you're not creating something, you're adding something to, so like a document note, for example. You've already got the document, you're just adding a note into it. So you're still creating something, but you're adding in. And inside of each of these roles, so let's say get items, it's going to give you how to write the request, all the responses, and then a sample response so you can see what kind of information is coming through. In my experience, one of the biggest problems that people run into is they start looking at this and they say, well, this is all in Counterpoint language. What does all of this mean? And that's the biggest challenge with the API, is going through and understanding this Counterpoint is running this data. So it's all going to come across in Counterpoint speak. So there's going to be a lot of underscores and abbreviation. If you do need any help with any of that, you can reach out to our support team and we can certainly help you figure out what's what. The other big problem that I see that people run into is they don't realize that, unlike the old way of doing it, where you'd put data in and if it didn't work, you'd get a Counterpoint error. When you put data in through the API, what ends up happening is Counterpoint's actually managing that data. So let's say you wanted to add a new customer into Counterpoint. Well, the new customer you have to make sure you have all the required fields you have set up in Counterpoint as part of that call. So a good example is, are they a cash or an accounts receivable customer? If you don't send that information across, Counterpoint doesn't know how to create it. It's essentially like you are in Counterpoint creating a new customer and forgetting to fill out a required field. That's going to send you back an error. The other thing that I've found is people not realizing the Counterpoint field restrictions. So for instance, address field 1 is going to have a 40 character limit out of the box in Counterpoint. If you send over 44 characters, they don't fit, it's going to send you an error and you're going to be pulling your hair out. So making sure that your code eliminates any issues there, possibly by moving to a different line or limiting the response to 40 characters, is going to eliminate a lot of the error issues that you may run into as part of the API. So I usually recommend, when you're going through and doing something like this, like let's say adding a new customer, go into Counterpoint and add a new customer right from the Counterpoint screen and see what fields are required, what your field lengths are, and what type of data is being expected out of Counterpoint, and then write your code accordingly. Let's jump back into presentation real quick here. Here's yeah, go for it. No.
I have a quick question, and I think I know the answer, but just wanted to have you verify. Does the API allow you to transfer or get item data, like similar to what would be transferred over to your accounting package?
When you say get, those are kind of two different things. You say get item data or get accounting data?
So perhaps accounting data on an item level?
So as of right now, there's no way inside of the API to see historical data. Everything that's happening inside the API, if we look at this, if you go through and look at these, you'll notice a trend, which is, get customer, get documents, stuff like that. This get document endpoint is a little confusing because everybody's like, well, I'll just get the historical document. And in theory, you can. Unfortunately, this get document is relying on the Counterpoint document ID, not like a ticket number or something easy like that, or sequential rather.
Okay.
It's that really long string of random document number. So it's unless you know specifically what you're trying to get, it's very challenging to pull historical data out. but you can pull item information. So anything that's in your item record, quantity on hand, item information, location information, stuff like that. You can certainly pull all that information out.
Okay.
Hopefully
cool.
that answers
Thanks,
that.
Alex.
Yeah. So this is that GitHub information. If you want to copy that down, or you can just search on GitHub and it comes right up if you search NCR Counterpoint. And really, as far as the API goes, I think a lot of it is just Q&A. We've got a lot of talented people on the call, so I'd like to kind of open it up and see if anybody has any questions about what they're specifically looking to do with the API, and see if we can start a conversation here about what people are looking to do, what's exciting for them, and then also just any general Q&A. Does anybody have any questions? All right, I'm just going through here as well, Ariel, to see if see questions.
I don't see any new questions. So Bernardo has a question. When you call an API, do you need any kind of authentication?
So when you configure the API, there's a couple of authentication. For most calls, you need the API key from NCR. So that's sent over in the header of your call. And it has to match what you've installed on the API server side. So that's a piece of authentication. The other thing is when you set up your API server, you actually set up permissions. So out of the box, all of these endpoints aren't just enabled for someone to come in and query your entire system. What you can do is you can actually set up a Counterpoint user. So you could name the Counterpoint user API or something like that. And that API user, what you do is you give them permissions to the endpoints that you want them to have permission to. And then when they make the call, so for instance, if you're adding a new customer or something like that, all of those changes are going to be logged in Counterpoint under that user. So if the user doesn't have the permissions in Counterpoint to make the change, it won't allow the change. And if the user doesn't have the permissions in the API service, then it won't be able to make the change as well. So it's kind of even though it's not asking you in the call for a password, like a user password, you do need to know that it's that user making the call and that they have the permissions to actually do that call.
All right, we have some more questions. Is the
Great.
API server a separate server from the Counterpoint server?
So the API server is, it's called an API server, but it's really more of a service. It doesn't have to be a separate machine. Obviously, it depends on your environment and your IT requirements, your business best practices. But our recommendation right now is that if you have an application server, that this is running on your application server. But it can, in theory, run on any machine that has access to the Counterpoint databases.
Okay. Is it possible to query orders by date?
Not at this time, no. Just so you can't query past orders or anything like that. You can, however, add new orders in. So I guess, again, it kind of goes back to the e-commerce side of things. It's not really focused at looking at historical data and looking at like sales reporting and stuff like that. It's much more focused on, okay, we're going to add a new order to Counterpoint, something like that.
Okay. How many RCS customers are using the API, and how long has the API been in existence?
API has been out for about a year at this point. It came out early last year. It's already, as I said earlier, it's already in the second version, so it's something that they're working on. Actually, this brings up a really good point. The API, where's my, it's right here. In the GitHub, there's also a really awesome issues section where you can create a new issue, like if you're having trouble with something. And there's a lot of stuff already in here that people have asked questions. And this is, the questions get answered. So it's like a bug reporting tool. But also, Mike Ritchie at NCR, who's kind of leading this whole project, looks at this thing, I'm pretty sure 24 hours a day. He's incredibly quick at getting back to people. And he's very passionate about the API and what its capabilities are and helping you solve problems. So this is actually a great tool to help you troubleshoot any issues you may be having as well, just as a free resource.
Awesome. So a couple more questions. Larry's full of great questions today. Is there something set up in the RCS data center in the hosted environment? Is this something that can be installed as part of the initial Counterpoint purchase or purchased separately and as an add-on?
Yeah, so as of right now, you can use this in the data center environment. It just needs to go through the RCS would need to install the API service for you. And then on top of that, we just need a change control form to open up the port. But we have customers in the data center using this tool currently. And then, yeah, we absolutely could roll new customers out with this program. And actually what we have been doing is rolling customers out with the registration file already turned on, the API registration file turned on. We haven't been installing the API server as standard just because then it opens up customers that don't want it to, have it just sitting there running for no reason. But that's an easy add-on at a later date. Okay,
we're getting a lot of really great questions. I have several more here. So Lynn,
great.
Welcome to the webinar. Is this only for customer-facing, or could we use this for people to see data who don't have Counterpoint installed on their machine?
No, you could absolutely, it can be whatever you want. I think a couple of good examples of the API would be integrating with we've got a customer right now that's has a custom built e-commerce application. So they're not using a Magento or a WooCommerce, they actually built their own. And they were able to build an integration to that platform using the API. So when a customer is added, kind of your typical e-commerce integration, when a customer is added online, they come into Counterpoint. When a customer is added in Counterpoint, they go up to the e-commerce store. When an order comes in online, it comes into Counterpoint. When a piece of information is updated in Counterpoint, it's going back up to the e-commerce site so they can do like a return in store, that sort of thing. And they were able to build that using the API. So that's one example. You could certainly use this to get information. I think another good example would be like customer information. So let's say you had a CRM like Salesforce and you wanted Salesforce to have all of your customer records from Counterpoint in it. You could use the API to either copy information from Counterpoint to Salesforce or Salesforce to Counterpoint. Just as one example, a lot of programs now have APIs, so it becomes a lot easier to integrate with third-party companies than it has been in the past.
All right. Is the API a REST-based API? Does it use JSON as data exchange?
Yes. Yeah, you can use, and this is getting a little bit into the fact that I'm not a developer, but basically you can use, let's see here. The standard is JSON. I believe you can also use XML and a couple of other options. But the standard is just JSON, and it is a REST API.
All right, great. Great. Okay, so another question from Bernardo. Does the endpoint, for example, get orders, have a limit of return values? What if the endpoint takes too long and generates a timeout on their end?
That's a great question. As far as I know, there's no limit of returns. Obviously, you have to remember that if you're you are querying data in real time. So in theory, you're putting a load on the SQL server. So similar to running a report with all of your, sales history in it or something, it's going to slow down the server and whatnot. I can look into that a little further and see if our developers have run into any challenges with that where it's not getting everything that they need all at once. See if there's a line limit that they're aware of. But as far as I know, it's as long as your SQL server can handle the query, you can do it.
Okay, I have a great question from Tiffany about loyalty points. Using the Counterpoint API, can they set up loyalty points for guests who will be shipping bourbon from the distillery to their wherever address they want it shipped to? And can they track loyalty points in-house and online?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is that's a great example of using the API to tie into an e-commerce system. So basically what you would need to do is work with your e-commerce solution to be able to display that information once it got to your e-commerce platform, and then obviously collect the points online and bring them back in the Counterpoint. One thing that I would recommend is using Counterpoint as your kind of one source of truth for information. So when they buy something online, you're not adding the loyalty points on the website, you're actually adding them when the order comes in the Counterpoint. And then when it comes back, once that customer's loyalty points are updated, the website is looking at Counterpoint to get that loyalty points information. So you could absolutely show the customer their loyalty points on your e-commerce site with an integration like that.
Awesome. How about PCI compliance? Does using the API impact PCI compliance in any way?
Well, that's a big question.
I know, Larry's full of great questions.
I love it. So PCI, as we all know, is a big, vague, crazy question. So I'm obligated to kind of put a disclosure on this and say everybody's environment's different, and one environment's PCI may be completely different than another environment's PCI. The Counterpoint API does not, because it's not pulling sales information and stuff like that, there's no way for you to get credit card information or credit card numbers or anything out of Counterpoint and out onto the broader web. That being said, if you're in a PCI DSS environment, basically anything that connects to the environment falls under scope of PCI. So it's possible that even though you're not pulling sensitive data out, that would still fall under scope. And what would fall under scope would be whatever platform you were pulling the data into. Now that would be a very gray stretch from a PCI compliance standpoint, because this was built with the intent of getting data out of a PCI environment. But that would be something that you'd really want to go over with your PCI team or with the RCS team to make sure that your environment stays PCI compliant with this tool.
Another great question. How often is the API updated, and is there a roadmap?
That's a great question. The API seems to be, we're on the second version, so it seems to be about every 6 months, give or take, we're getting a version update. As of right now, and this is just what I'm aware of, it's possible that I'm not aware of the full picture, but what I've heard from NCR is that this is a top priority on their roadmap for Counterpoint. They're trying to get Counterpoint to be very easy to integrate into third-party and other NCR systems, and this is the way that they're going to do that. So I'm very hopeful that in the next 6 to 12 months, we see a lot more endpoints and a lot more things opened up in the API. But honestly, in the last year, they've done more work on the API than a lot of other things inside of Counterpoint itself. So, you can just tell from what's happening with the API, even just from version 1 to version 2, that they really feel strongly about this product and its longevity. So I think that you're going to see this continue to grow and possibly even start to get some of that historical data functionality moving forward.
Awesome. Okay. And then the next question is there versioning of the API, which I think you answered already because we're on version 2, and there will be, I think there's another version that's slated for release in the near future. Is that correct, Alex?
I haven't heard anything specifically, but honestly, you actually may be more in touch with that than I am on a day-to-day basis. It wouldn't surprise me at all. It's about that time that they would be looking at another version. The nice thing with the version updates is really the only thing that needs to be updated, other than making sure it's compatible with your current version of Counterpoint. The only thing that needs to be updated is the API server, which is just an application. You just run the application and update it to the latest version. So it's it's much easier to update the API than it is Counterpoint, and it seems to be a very stable upgrade process. So it's nice and easy to do, and it seems like they're coming out pretty frequently.
Okay, so Larry offered some clarification, versioning of the endpoints. I don't know what that means.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So the endpoints are not versioned as of now. All endpoints will work on all versions of the API. The biggest changes that they've made thus far is just some endpoint additions, which work in both versions. A couple of the big changes they made in version 2 is they have opened up, and I honestly haven't seen anybody really put this to use, but they opened up secure pay inside of the API. So in theory, and again, I haven't seen it used yet, but in theory, I'll go to this endpoint here. Where is it? In theory, you would actually be able to, it's in here, actually. I believe it's this guy. In theory, you would actually be able to pass a payment token through the API to allow like a third party, like a kiosk or something like that, to be able to swipe a credit card and have it still processed through secure pay via Counterpoint. That was a big improvement, and that was something that they were working very hard on to get opened up. And I'll have to track down the specific endpoint for that. So that was a big improvement. And then really the other big improvements were just stability and error reporting. In version 1, there was very little error reporting. Version 2 has a much more advanced error reporting layout, which is helpful.
Cool. All right. Another great question from Larry. Do you think there is a role to call the API literally during the cashier or sales process, where the cashier is using Counterpoint, calling out to the API to do something special related to the sales process?
That's a great question. Let me think about that one for a second. So basically making a call out and then trying to make an edit on the sales transaction while the cashier was in process. I think we'd have to get with the developers on that one. I think that realistically, theoretically you could, because what you can do is if you know the document ID, which at that point you probably would if it was an order or something, if you could send that out to your middleware program, then that could actually query that document and make an adjustment either at the time or after the fact. I would think that you would want to make all those adjustments after the fact, just from a stability standpoint. But I'd want to know more about specifically what you were trying to accomplish by that to give you a firm answer. And obviously at a certain point, get hooked up with the developers to, make sure that they thought it was something that you could actually execute on.
Great. And Larry, I'm going to reach out to you offline to see if we can schedule a call. And you're done with your questions. Oh no, I was enjoying those. Okay, Lynn, does NCR have a running list of what people are using this for? Like you said, they can get from the key each time. So I thought you mentioned that they are kind of keeping tabs on what people are using it for.
Yeah, so NCR does have a list somewhere in NCR HQ. That is a list of all the API keys that have been requested. that's not something that they're going to distribute, obviously, for security reasons, as well as just making sure that they're not spreading around your private information. But that being said, like I said, I have seen them notice that there's duplication and actually making an effort to connect the two customers if both customers want to be connected. So we had an example of a customer working on the same integration as somebody else, and NCR reached out to both customers independently and said, hey, do you guys want to work together? And at that point, when both customers said, yeah, sure, that'd be great, NCR made the connection and sent over all the contact information that they would need to make that happen, and they were able to work together and build the integration. So it's one of those, like, they're not going to give you a full list, but they do have it, and that's definitely the goal, is to kind of have a private marketplace, as it were, of who's doing what with it.
Awesome. So would this listing here on GitHub be more accurate for what is available for this function?
So as far as the GitHub is the up to the second repository of everything Counterpoint API. So as new versions are released, as glitches and bugs are found, as questions are answered, everything is done through this GitHub. So you'll even find that, for instance, if you were to call our developers here at RCS, if they didn't immediately know the answer, they would actually go out and put the question on the GitHub so that everybody can see the Q&A that's happening. So the goal of the API is to make it as public as possible so that everybody's on the same page and no one has more information than somebody else. So really, that is absolutely the be-all, end-all of documentation. Beyond that, it's really just like our developers obviously have more experience with it just because they're working in it every day. But all the actual information is just on the GitHub.
All right. Does that answer your question, Lynn? Sort of.
Sort of. Perfect. And Lynn, if you do have if you want to set up a conversation with Ariel as well, I'm happy to sit on that or get one of our developers on the phone so we can have a more in-depth conversation.
Okay. So I have a few people that I think we're interested in scheduling a call with you next week, Alex. So I'll reach out to everybody that wants to schedule a one-on-one with Alex for sometime within the next couple of weeks. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, so I'll just give everybody another minute or two to maybe type up some questions in case something comes to mind.
And while we're waiting on any last-minute questions, as everybody here knows, I'm sure, you can reach out to Ariel and Amanda, the two account managers here, anytime to get questions answered or get resources here at RCS that might help you with your API development goals or anything else that you have questions on. Certainly, they can loop me into anything that they need help with, or that we need to get on a phone call to figure out specifically what your goals are and make sure we have the RCS resources available to help you out. And really thank everybody for coming to the webinar. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully we gave you plenty of reading material for this evening. So be sure to go check out that GitHub, and after that, let me know if there's any additional questions.
All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions. So I just want to thank you all for coming. And yes.
Sorry, one more thing, Ariel, before we sign off. Also, if anybody's interested in the RCS kind of API portal that I showed you, where you don't have to do any development work, you can just copy paste onto a website or a portal or something, reach out to Ariel as well, and she can get you some additional information on that, and we can show you how that works and give you a more in-depth demo, because that is something that we're looking to roll out to customers as they need it, who don't want to go build their own setup, as it were. So certainly let us know if you're interested in that as well.
Awesome. Great addition.
That's all I got.
Right, well,
thank you, everybody.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And again, if you have questions, comments, reach out to me and let me know. If you wanted to schedule a call with Alex, I'll reach out to you after this webinar and set that up. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody.